Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Sound is good in the room? And online folks, I hope you can hear okay. Just a couple of quick follow-ups from, well, this introduction just now and also Karen's introduction earlier. First of all, I don't touch my own Wikipedia page, so I can't vouch for the accuracy of what's there. I want to confirm that ATALA is older than ACL. ACL was established, I looked it up, in 1962, so ATALA wins by 3 years. And also, the NLP, the TAL community in France, also is much ahead of the rest of the international research community on the issues that we're talking about here. I wish I could have been here 10 years ago. I was involved with the organization of the EACL workshop in 2017 that Karen mentioned, which we had initially called the first workshop on ethics and NLP. This is not accurate. It was Kevin Cohen who contacted me and maybe a couple of the other organizers and said, you know, this is not actually the first workshop on ethics and NLP. So we reframed that as the first ACL workshop on ethics and NLP, which was at least accurate. And so it is a great honor to be here in the 10-year anniversary of what you all have been doing here in France, and just a great pleasure to be here. So my title is Meaning Making with Artificial Interlocutors and Risks of Language Technology. And the last opening thing that I want to say is I talk too fast. And I'm going to do my best to slow down. But if I fail, please do this. Right? And I will interpret that gesture. And also, I would never be able to give this talk in French, but I understand pretty well. So questions or later in the coffee break, I'm happy to be approached in French. All right, in a nutshell, we humans are remarkably quick to make meaning of language that we encounter, and we do that by imagining a mind behind the language. Artificial agents, on the other time, have at best limited capacity for communicative intent, and some natural language systems have none at all. If we want to mitigate the risks of language technology, we have to recognize and account for this rather than taking advantage of it. One last thing I meant to say at the beginning, that bit.ly link is a link to a PDF of my slides. The reason I do that is that there's a bibliography, so you can get the work cited. It's on one more slide, and then it comes back at the end. So I'm going to talk first about meaning making when humans talk to each other, and then talk about computers and communicative intent, and then look at what happens when humans encounter computer-generated text, what are the failure modes and risks, and what are some mitigation strategies. But I'm going to start with some pure linguistics. So there's this wonderful observation due to Halliday 1970 that this sign here, dogs must be carried, is ambiguous. So you might have a person with a nice small poodle who thinks, great, I'll carry my cute cuddly dog, and someone with a large, heavy, I don't know, German Shepherd or whatever, saying, oh no, I can't carry this dog. Somebody else who doesn't have a dog, whoops, where'd he go? Thinking, no muddy paws for me, it's all good. And this other fellow who says, no one told me I had to bring a dog, right? Or if you're M.A.K. Halliday, you might sit down and think, interpretation depends on intonation. Or if you're Barbara Partee, truth conditions depend on information structure. Okay. So all of this to say that we are making sense of this language and we're bringing our own context to it. It is important to note that despite appearances to the contrary, meaning is not in text. So I have an example for you where I ask you, what does this sentence mean? If you can read this language, please sit back and feel smug. Everybody else, what does this sentence mean? Also, what does the speaker mean by uttering this sentence? The reason I'm showing you a language that I hope you're unfamiliar with is to differentiate between the form of the language and the meaning, because when we encounter text in our own languages, it's very difficult to see that difference. But just for fun, so I have, first of all, revealed this is Japanese. Does that help? No. I have tokenized the text. A little hard to see, but I put some white space. That help? How about transliteration? Right, little bit. You might have a sense of something that it's about, right? You recognize sensei, maybe, recognize Pokemon, maybe. Okay, now I'm going to translate the content words. Better, right? Now I'm going to translate the function words too. You might have a pretty strong guess as to what this sentence means, and you're probably wrong, right? Because Japanese is a head final language. This sentence means, according to the teacher, girls like Pokemon more than boys do. Right? So the point there is, in order to get to the standing meaning of the sentence, you have to have not only the meaning of the words, not only the meaning of the grammatical formatives, but also knowledge of the structure of the language. And then you can put all of that together to get to the meaning of the sentence. And then you can ask, okay, but what did the speaker mean by uttering this sentence? All right, so that bullet point was just that, right? So if we have grammatical lexical knowledge, we can get from a text to a standing or conventional meaning, but that's actually only the first step. You take standing meaning and common sense and coherence relations, and from there you get to the public commitments. That is what the person is on record as having said. And then you can do even more reasoning, but starting first with the public commitments, if A says, I wonder whether I should take my umbrella, is it raining? B says yes, then B is publicly committed to the truth of the proposition, it is raining, right? A has said, is it raining? B has said yes. And then if A goes outside and it's a beautiful sunny day, A could turn to B and say, you lied or you were misinformed, right? That's public commitments, but you can do further reasoning based on common sense and other context. And so A might follow up and say, oh, so you do think I should take my umbrella. But here B can legitimately say, I didn't say that. Right? B did effectively say it's raining, but B said nothing about the umbrella. So those are the perlocutionary consequences. What else happens to the beliefs and other things around you because of what you've said? The next important point here is that conversation is a joint activity. There's a wonderful book by Herb Clark from 1996. I think it's called On Using Language. And he breaks down how when we have a conversation, we are entering into a joint activity with our conversation partner. The wonderful problem with this book is that it is impossible to summarize, but it is also not dense. Like it's not dense, but it's harder to say what he said in any shorter words. So I hereby recommend the book. There's also great work by Baldwin, 1995, looking at language acquisition, I think, but talking about communication as intersubjective awareness. So the part I've highlighted on the bottom here, I'm just going to read. The aspect of intersubjective awareness that accompanies joint attention, the recognition that mental focus on some external thing is shared, is what's so key. And that's what allows infant and child language learners to basically bootstrap their way into language, because they do this joint attention together with their caregivers. Okay. The cool thing is that even though face-to-face small group communication is the most well-studied and probably the most basic use of language, we can also communicate asynchronously and distantly. So we don't have to be, once we've learned a language, we don't have to be co-present with our interlocutor. But when we are not co-present, we're still applying the same skills of imagining that we were doing intersubjective awareness with somebody and thinking about what they must be trying to say as they choose their words. There's some interesting developmental work showing that theory of mind developmental milestones, that is how well growing children can imagine the point of view of someone else, are actually linked to reading comprehension. So the better you are at understanding how other people are thinking about things, the better you are at reading, because reading is going to require that. I also turned up something from the hermeneutics literature from Ricoeur in 1973, who writes, not that we can conceive of a text without an author. The tie between the speaker and the discourse is not abolished, but distended and complicated. And so this is coming back to the point that when we encounter a textual artifact, even if the author is very far removed from us in time, we are still imagining, doing our best to imagine that author. It's worth pointing out that there are some things we can't do when we're interpreting texts. So Dingemans et al. Do wonderful work looking at the way we confirm and repair understandings with back channels and nods. Alexi just gave me a nice nod a moment ago. And that helps us stay in that state of intersubjectivity. So we can't do that with an author of a text that we're not co-present with, but we still are projecting a model of mind. So to summarize this section, meaning making in human-human interaction involves communication as a joint activity in which we are using language, among other signals, to convey and understand communicative intents. And we do this even if we're not co-present with our interlocutors. So that's the people side of things. What about computers? Can computers have communicative intent? Okay, this is probably a deep philosophical question, but let's have a go, starting with the dogs must be carried sign. Does that sign itself have communicative intent? I would say clearly not. It's a piece of metal that doesn't even have any moving parts. It does represent the communicative intent of some person or group of people, but it's not the sign's own communicative intent. How about a calculator? Right? Well, it can produce answers to different questions, but I think it's probably still best understood as representing some group of people's intent to provide accurate answers given a system of rules. What about slot-filling dialogue agents? So like the old ATALA system, we think about English language NLP. This was a system where you supposedly were going to call on the telephone and very slowly get information about flights to make an airline booking. Web pages where you can just directly go at the database are so much better. But anyway, that's what the system was. Here, I think we could say that the dialogue agent has a programmed intent to elicit information about parameters of the flight scheduling request that in particular map to concepts in its database. And then once it's gathered enough information, it has another programmed intent to provide information about flights from the database that match the parameters of the request. What about conversational chatbots like ChatGPT, but also Eliza from 1966? Here you might say the only intent is for the chatbot to output text that is engaging and on topic. But I think this intent is too far removed from the standing meaning of the text that it's actually outputting to really count as the communicative intent of that text. Okay, so going back for a moment to the linguistics at the start, standing meaning plus common sense plus coherence relations gives us public commitments. And they're called public commitments because we're on record as having said them. And there's cool results from Laskarides and Asher there showing that that's true even when it's due to a covert coherence relation. So if I say, is it raining? And you say yes, that's a covert coherence relation. There's other ones. You are on record as having said it's raining, even though the only thing you literally did was utter the token yes. So that's a cool thing about language. If a person's public commitments turn out to be false, then we're either lying or misinformed. But who or what is accountable for a machine's utterances? At the moment, we're actually lacking systems of accountability. So all of that was thinking about, can computers have communicative intent and public commitments? Can they recognize communicative intent? So that dogs must be carried sign, obviously not, is completely inert. A calculator, yes, in a limited way, right? A calculator can recognize the communicative intent. I wish to know what this expression evaluates to. My next one. I don't know why it was taking so long. The slot-filling dialogue systems or virtual assistants, so not just the old ATAS system, but if you think about Siri and Alexa and Google Assistant, these ones I think can recognize within the limited range of intents that they can do something about, right? Set an alarm, turn on the lights, and so on. Language models as chatbots? No, they are not recognizing communicative intent. They are designed to look as if they are, but all they're doing is taking a prompt as input and carrying on with a plausible continuation as output. There's a nice paper from 2021 critiquing work on so-called AI, where they say that the whole field has taken a behaviorist turn and therefore fails to model the aspects of human-human interaction that make it a joint activity. That is the co-construction, we're doing it together, and the mentalizing. We are modeling each other's state of mind. So if an agent, like Siri, Alexa, and so on, can only recognize pre-programmed communicative intents, it's doing a thin kind of communication, but it can't engage in the fullness of intersubjective joint activities. And that's fine. We don't need the computers to engage in the fullness of intersubjective joint activities. We just need to understand what it is that they're doing and not dress them up in misleading ways. Okay. I'd like to put this in. This came up 2 weeks ago again, but aren't people just stochastic parrots too? This is an argument that's frequently proposed to me on Twitter, over email, in conversations after talks, where people will say something like, how do I know that you aren't just reflecting back patterns of language use? Or when I describe language models as stochastic parrots, I get, well, isn't that just what people do? The answer is no, and this argument is inherently dehumanizing. Surely the person making the argument perceives their own agency in speaking and otherwise. But when you ask that question, you're casting doubt that your interlocutor has similar agency, i.e. full humanity. So I took my frustration with this question and channeled it into that paper that's linked there, that was initially a talk at CogSci 2022 called Resisting Dehumanization in the Age of AI. And it's now appeared as a short paper in Current Directions in Psychological Science. Okay, so talked about meaning making among humans, talked about computers and communicative intent. Now I want to talk about what happens when we encounter computer-generated text. And this will be interesting. Do I have a mouse? Where? It's there. Okay. So this, if I can get it to play, is a video from 1944 from an experiment where Heider and Simmel showed that you, as a human, attribute personality characteristics to shapes and construct a whole narrative based only on movements. So is it going to go? No. Oh, well. The link is in the slides, I think. What happens here is the triangles move around differently, and it starts looking like the big triangle is aggressive and the small triangle is protective, and the ball ends up being what's being protected by the little triangle, and in the end, they manage to lock the big triangle in the box, and the little ones escape. All right. 1944, they did an experiment showing this video to people and getting them to describe what they saw, and everyone was attributing personality and motivation to these shapes. Right? If we'll do that much interpretation of just shapes, how much more do we do when it's language, which is something that we usually only encounter from other people? And that's an observation due to Margaret Mitchell, and the bit.ly link there is a podcast episode that she and I were on together. Okay, sorry that didn't work. Another important part of this is that in doing meaning making, though we are trying to interpret things from the other person's point of view, what did they mean by saying that to me? We are also always bringing our own context. And we're going to do that based on what's going on in the current situation and our entire lived experience. So I have my people from the beginning here with the dogs. They're going to interpret that sign very differently depending on what's going on with them. Do they have a little dog, a big dog, no dog? Are they a linguist? Right? So I now have some examples of things going wrong when we are making sense of the output of computers. These examples are distressing because they are things going wrong. And in particular, I wanted to sort of flag what's coming up. So there's stereotypes regarding Black Americans. There's machines urging self-harm. There's stereotypes about the Kannada language from Southern India. There's some dehumanization of Native North American people. And most distressingly in the current moment, some stereotypes about Palestinians. The reason I'm showing you these things is not to like gawk and be voyeurs about this stuff. But I think it's important that we know that these problems exist, while acknowledging that there's some harm in repeating them, even with that framing. And I'm always open to feedback onto how to convey this message. If there's something you have in mind and you have the energy to share it with me, I'm all ears. If you want to check out of this, it's safe to come back in about 10 slides, and feel free to do whatever you need to do to protect your mental health. Okay, example one. we have an example of old school templatic generation with automatic placement of text. This is some really important work by Professor Latanya Sweeney, published in 2013, where she discovered that African-American sounding names triggered a different version of ad copy than white sounding names. And in particular, she discovered this because somebody was in her office and interested in finding some of her work, and so typed her name in to Google search, and in the sidebar, up popped Latanya Sweeney arrested. So she did a very systematic study and found, not surprising from today's point of view, that there was bias in there, and that this was advertisements for a company that provides like background information on people, and it was just portrayed differently depending on the perceived race associated with the name. So what, if any, communicative intent does the machine have, or maybe the corporation behind it in this context? The corporation certainly is click here so we can get paid. Right? We want you to click on our ad so that we can sell you something, or Google wants you to click on that ad so they get money. They are also maybe interested in eliciting viewer behavior to choose among different versions of the ad. And Professor Sweeney's hypothesis here is not that it was deliberately set up like this, but that over time, the ads that generated more clicks bifurcated, and so the pattern was reified. What are the perlocutionary consequences? What happens in the world because of this communication? Well, it's going to cast suspicion about the person being searched for, regardless of the search context, right? And you can imagine this could have downstream effects on someone's getting a job, for example, if you've got this subliminal message that they might have been arrested. Now I have a few examples of cases of untethered generation. So this is places where people set up systems that would just, output plausible next words, as we're familiar with. So back in 2016, Microsoft put a chatbot called Tay on Twitter that was yanked within 24 hours. It was designed to, in quotes, learn from its interlocutors. And so, of course, people got a hold of it and trained it to say sexist, racist, and other bigoted remarks, and Microsoft had to take it down. Shortly after GPT-3 was released in 2020, someone created something called Philosopher AI that was then used by yet someone else to automate responses on the social media site Reddit. And it was only detected because it was too prodigious. It was posting too much to be a person. And so people figured out that it was GPT-3 driven. But in the meantime, it engaged on sensitive topics, including conspiracy theories and suicide. May 2023, the US National Eating Disorder Association replaced its helpline, where people could call in crisis around eating disorders, with a chatbot that promptly started offering harmful advice, recommending disordered eating to people calling in. And October 2023, New York City set up a chatbot for answering legal questions. This one just hit the news last week. Of course, it gave out false information. So the idea was you've got 2,000 web pages of New York City regulations, and a small business owner would like to know if they're required to accept cash, for example. Well, this thing is completely unreliable, but set up by New York City as an information access point. February 2024, this one's fun. Air Canada ended up having to actually honor a bereavement fare that was offered to a customer by its chatbot on its website. And they tried in the small claims court in British Columbia to say, well, no, that wasn't us, that was the chatbot. Fortunately, the judge was like, no, that was your webpage, it still counts. Okay, so here too, what's the communicative intent of the machine? These chatbots are designed only for engagement without any commitment to the content, or without any, no accountability, right? It's just about, let's provide a plausible continuation. Plausible and correct are not the same thing. How does public commitment and accountability function here? Well, if you don't have control over specific content, which human or organization would want to be accountable for it? And yet, over and over and over again, we're seeing organizations put these things up in ways that they have to be accountable. So New York City's thing, for example. Perlocutionary consequences here are varied and drastic, especially in scenarios where the machine is presented as possibly human or even artificial but knowledgeable, because people are going to be primed to believe it. So that's the untethered generation. I've also got some examples of incorrect answers presented authoritatively. So for a while, this comes from someone called Hank Green on Twitter. if you searched on Google, when did people come to America? You got an answer that started with the first colony was founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, right? There were people in the Americas well before that. At the same time, if you asked, did it not come? When did humans come to America? Then you got this answer called 33,000 years ago and so on. So what's the communicative intent here? Presumably to provide an answer to a user's question from the linked document, pulling out the most relevant snippet. That's what that is programmed to do. Who's publicly committed to the message? Well, that underlying text with the stuff about Jamestown, with its full context, that's actually, unfortunately, the US Library of Congress, which is an issue. But the coherence relation of answer, saying this text is an answer to your question, that's on Google, right? That pairing is on Google. And thinking again about perlocutionary consequences, we should ask, what might the searcher learn from this answer? And consider especially native and non-native children in the US, in that sort of an educational context. Another similar example, answering ill-formed questions. Oh, I guess, okay, so that was incorrect stuff presented authoritatively. There's another issue when the question itself is ill-formed. So PC Mohan MP pointed out on Twitter that for a while, if you asked Google for the ugliest language in India, instead of getting an answer like, that doesn't make sense, there's no such thing as an ugliest language, it said Kannada, and then says it in text, and then insult to injury, you could hear this out loud if you want to. And here comes the one about Palestinians. What do terrorists wear on their head? Right. Again, aside from maybe the white hoods of the KKK, there's not an answer that makes sense to this question, but what comes back is the Palestinian keffiyeh, and this isn't really fixed, right? This used to be pulled out as a snippet. Now, if you do this search on Google, this last I tried, you got like a link to the Wikipedia page for the keffiyeh mixed in with news coverage of this problem. Okay, so again, what's the communicative intent? Same, provide an answer to the user's question from the linked document, pulling out the most relevant snippet. Public commitments. Well, if you answer a question with invalid presuppositions, such as there being characteristic headwear of terrorists, you are implicitly accepting these presuppositions into the common ground. You are saying, yes, I validate those presuppositions, and now I will answer your question. So by answering these questions, Google is committing to there being some language that is recognized as the ugliest and some characteristic headgear for terrorists. They shouldn't be. And then further committing to the specific answers. Perlocutionary consequences. Well, someone who is holding the beliefs presupposed in those questions is going to get reinforcement of those beliefs, which is clearly bad for bystanders and also arguably bad for that person. For someone who's subject to the stereotype, there's going to be the psychological harm of seeing the stereotype repeated, plus the sense that everyone must think so for Google to be reflecting it back like that. And there I'm really referring to the work of Sophia Noble, who already pointed out this problem just giving links, lists of links. So she points out that her primary example was if you put in the phrase Black girls, when she started doing this research on Google, you got links to pornography. And she says, in essence, the social context or meaning of derogatory or problematic Black women's representations in Google's ranking is normalized by virtue of their placement, making it easier for some people to believe that what exists on the page is strictly the result of the fact that more people are looking for Black women in pornography than anything else. This is because the public believes that what rises to the top in search is either the most popular or the most credible or both. And it's not true, right? Google has set up a whole advertising economy that is what's driving things there. So this is not just a question of looking at decontextualized results, but in fact, we never get context freeness. We are recontextualizing them. And what Google is saying is, here's an objective view of the information in the world. And that is a kind of recontextualization that can be very harmful. So already a problem with search results is a list of web pages, similarly problematic with image search results. It gets worse when you have these snippets pulled out from web pages. It gets worse with the answer boxes. And then when we try to use chatbots as replacements for search, it gets even worse. And I've got a couple of papers on that. So if we're going to be designing applications that involve text that is generated or placed in open-ended ways, we should be considering a nuanced view of how meaning-making happens, keeping in mind that neither questions nor answers are just text strings. And they're also, by the way, not just logical forms, right? It's useful to map from the text string to a meaning representation, but there's still much more to it than that when we talk about communicative intent and the context that we bring and the models of mind. Also, people will interpret strings in languages we know. We can't help ourselves. And we're going to do that by building a model of mind of the person or entity or group behind the text, using the context the string appears in, and using the context that we bring to the interaction. All of that stuff happens reflexively. So if we're going to be designing these kinds of systems, we need to be thinking about who's going to be encountering and interpreting the text. And I think this goes back to the earlier presentation about not thinking just about technological solutions, but thinking about technology in its social context. We need to be considering many different kinds of people and different kinds of experiences. So this comes from value-sensitive design, where we might think about, what about children encountering this? What about people who bring strong prejudices into the situation? What about people who are subject to the stereotypes at hand? What about people who have limited understanding of the fallibility of computers? What about people who are stressed or busy or tired or not paying much attention? There's a whole set of examples that I suppressed about a time when I was searching for some health information because a person close to me was in an emergency situation, and I completely ran afoul of this terrible confluence of Google snippets and the way healthcare works in America that wasted about an hour of time that I could go into later. So, and that was me. I know how these things work, but I was stressed and tired in that kind of situation. We should also think about accountability. Who's accountable for what's being said? When, if ever, is untethered generation appropriate? Who will the people who are encountering the text attribute it to? And oftentimes very reasonably. So if we think back to that chatbot from the New York City, legal system, or the thing on Air Canada, perfectly reasonable for that person who was trying to buy a bereavement fare from Air Canada, asking about their policy on Air Canada's website, to attribute what came back from the chatbot to Air Canada, and the courts agreed, right? But Air Canada didn't. When should an organization be comfortable with untethered or even partially guided natural language generation being done in its name? Very, very rarely, if ever. And then what about cases where people unleash bots without an obvious responsible operator? So that philosopher AI thing on Reddit. Okay, so what else can we do? Well, we should at the bare minimum be doing curation of training data. We don't want to just hoover up garbage, knowing that it can be spat back out and interpreted by humans. But this is worse than garbage in, garbage out. Right? You can take a very nicely curated data set, use it to train a language model, and then produce some untethered generation that's still going to be giving non-information. So indiscriminate collection of data makes it worse, but clean data doesn't fix it. I think we should be thinking about transparency by design and visibility to users. So bare minimum, again, it should always be clear that the interlocutor is a machine. Right? If we've encountered synthetic text, we should know that it's synthetic. It should also be clear to the users, what can this thing actually do? What are the affordances of this system? And where does the information come from? So what's its training data? If it's pointing you to, if it's a search engine, what's the range of documents that it could possibly be returning? Right? If I come to the New York City webpage with a question that's actually something that's regulated at a US federal level, I might not get the answer, and I should know that there's a possible larger answer out there that I didn't see. And then in what ways might it be inaccurate? All right. I don't think Google should be answering questions. I don't think ChatGPT should be answering questions. We also need to be careful not to present the web as total or so big that it must be representative, right? It's big, but it is still a specific artifact distributed. And there's some applications which I think are never appropriate. So robotherapists, as much as people keep proposing it. And so we need to resist rather than leaning into the human reflex to imagine a mind behind the text. And I don't mean resisting that as individuals, I mean resisting that as technologists when we design these systems to, for example, given the existence of ChatGPT, there's no reason it should use first-person pronouns. That's just reinforcing this notion that there's a mind in there. Almost done. As appealing as conversational interfaces seem to be, sometimes, in fact, often the answer is don't, all right? A successfully conversational interface will elicit credence. It's going to make people want to believe, while likely being very opaque about its actual affordances. And what we have with the large language models now is the ability to very successfully mimic conversation, but mimicking conversation isn't usually what we need. So in that New York City example, what was needed was actually a search interface to about 2,000 city web pages, not a chatbot that was going to make stuff up while pointing to those web pages. All right, at a policy level, so collectively, we should be asking questions like, how do we create information systems for the public good rather than for advertising and other corporate interests? Right? Library and information science used to be collective activities. It's only really since the commercial web that it became, well, there's some precedents with like LexisNexis and stuff like that. But for the most part, individual people who needed information would go to the public library. Right? And it's with the advent of the commercial web that we started looking to corporations. We should avoid amplifying biased views, especially those held by the majority and those in power. But how do we go about doing that? And there's some really interesting work by Ali Al-Khatib and Abeba Berhane on that point. How do we require transparency, recognizably synthetic media, disclosure of training data, and accountability? What are the regulatory regimes that we need in place to make that happen? And then finally, it can't be the only solution. We can't push this all on individuals, but also how do we promote information literacy in the face of these technologies? And that is, again, referring to the earlier presentation, I think one of the things that we can do as NLP specialists is educate the people around us about what's going on and how to make sense of it. Okay, so I like to leave people with the message, don't be too impressed. Just because some particular piece of text seems coherent doesn't mean the model behind it has understood anything or is trustworthy in any way. Just because one answer was correct doesn't mean the next one will be. When a computer seems to speak our language, we're actually the ones doing all of the work. So here's what I told you, and the link to the slides again. We are remarkably quick to make meaning of language when we encounter it, and we do that by imagining a mind behind the language. Artificial agents, on the other hand, have limited capacity at best for communicative intent, and the really famous ones right now have none. If we're going to mitigate the risks of language technology, we're going to have to recognize and account for these facts rather than taking advantage of them. I look forward to your questions.